Hello and welcome to this video on why raw milk is a bad idea, despite a range of contrarians trying to argue to the opposite. Milk is almost, if not always, a staple food today. It is a relatively short-lived product that is rich in lipids, minerals, and protein. Despite being stable when refrigerated for a few weeks at most, it has a very short shelf life outside of refrigeration. What makes milk so stable under ideal conditions is that it gets pasteurized. Pasteurization is typically at a temperature below 100 degrees Celsius, or roughly 212 freedom units, and the milk is held at this temperature for between 20 seconds and up to 30 minutes. This kills all bacteria within the milk and has a little harmful effect on the milk's nutritional value. Some kinds of pasteurization can affect taste, but it doesn't alter the nutritional value. Up to and until Louis Pasteur made this discovery in the late 1800s, milk was not processed and is what we call raw milk. That is milk that has not been pasteurized. Because it is not treated in any way, it has bacteria present, does not store as long, and is not available year-round. There are some issues we'll get to in due course as well. To be clear in this case, we are only discussing pasteurization and not homogenization, which is the consistent mixing of the lipids or the cream that is in milk. The milk has a kinda lumpy but relatively safe texture. It's not particularly pleasant for many people to drink, but others like it for some reason. There are advocates for raw milk that claim it's good for you, and this might be true, except for there's a big problem with their argument. History. History has proven that that's just not true. At least with regards to better documented, let's say, historical evidence, we have, epidemiology in short. Mostly North American and European for the purposes of this video, but it's generally applicable across the world. When you look at the, say, mid-19th century, so the roughly 50 years before pasteurization became widespread, infant mortalities were really high. We're talking anywhere up to 60 times higher than what they are now. And most estimates say between 30 and 60 times what we currently see. So that means you would have roughly 5 to 6 deaths per 1,000 live births at the moment. You'd have somewhere between 180 to 360 or so deaths per 1,000 live births a year. So that's about a third of all kids, and then some again. Now, germ theory, Pasteur's work, and so on pretty much proved that, microbes are responsible for this, and this meant that a lot of microbial pathogens that could be found in milk were not only identified, but efforts were put into figuring out how to stop them from being a pathogen and causing problems. Now, example pathogens that were not just milk-borne, but common at the time, and technically still are things like bovine tuberculosis, brucellosis, salmonellosis, streptococcal infections, diphtheria, and what was called summer diarrhea at the time. When you pasteurized milk in the mid to late 18th century, well, those rates dropped. Now, we're not saying that it is solely and completely down to dairy hygiene practices, and there were other medical advances at the same time that contributed to this, but it is not to say that it was only those medical advances. Food safety was a major factor as well. One thing we can look at when we're examining this historical data is differences between urban areas and essentially rural or country areas. Inside of areas that are, let's say, more rural, that is, those areas that had far more ready and easy access to milk and therefore fresh milk, infant mortality rates were lower, somewhere between 100 and 200 per 1,000 live births. Whereas once you got further into urban areas, that number went up significantly. The rise could be as high as the previously mentioned 360 or so deaths per 1,000 live births, but more consistent numbers seem to be somewhere north of 300, so not that far off. It's better to perhaps say similar numbers. And one of the major reasons was, well, milk-related illnesses. Nearly 20 to 30% of infant deaths were attributed to gastrointestinal infections that were derived, or at least traced back, to contaminated milk, raw milk at this time. Now, gastrointestinal infections was the medical term for what was called summer diarrhea. And you'll understand in due course why it's summer diarrhea, simply because, well, as most people are aware, milk requires refrigeration. In winter, you have a natural refrigerator. In summer, you have the exact opposite. Now, we have to look at why it is that raw milk can be dangerous, and most people will claim that this just isn't true, but no, it is. To start with, there are a range of pathogens. We've already touched on some of them, but you have things like Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, monocytogens, Campylobacter, Staph aureus, and a range of others again, and that's above and beyond things like tuberculosis. Now, whether we're talking about cow milk, goat milk, sheep milk, or any other milk you want to drink, they will be able to transmit these pathogens because they don't come from just nothing. They're not in the milk naturally. Much like human milk, it is sterile as such until it gets outside the human body, or in this case the cow, goat, sheep, etc. It's a process called udder infections or mastitis. The outside of the udder is not sterile. It's exposed to the outside world. It really can't be sterile. And as such, when you milk it, or handle the udders, you transmit whatever's on the udder into the milk. This leads to contamination, and that's, let's say, separate issues again to things like contaminated water, soil, whatever else is being used, or in the area around what's going on. The next issue is that, raw milk isn't pasteurized. Now, pasteurization kills off all of these aforementioned bacteria and other pathogens. So obviously, if they're there and they've been transmitted, they're going to wind up in the milk and they're not going to be killed off, so you'll be consuming them. And you'll be consuming them quite some time after they've had plenty of opportunity to colonize that milk, meaning you're not getting a small amount that could have just inadvertently been transmitted to the milk. No, you're getting quite a bit more that's not only gotten into the milk, but bred or multiplied within that milk. The next obvious argument from a lot of people is, even if there are bacteria in there, they're probiotics, they're good bacteria. And not really. One of the major things to be aware of is that most bacteria within your GI tract are pretty much well established early on, and it takes a massive shift to cause a change in that. And this is why introducing new bacteria can often lead to illness. Generally opportunistically, but also massive ingestion of contaminated milk is kind of going to overwhelm any naturally occurring defenses and overwhelm whatever's already in your GI tract. So in terms of salmonella, we have diarrhea, abdominal cramps, and severe complications like sepsis. E. coli can cause all sorts of issues such as bloody diarrhea, kidney failure, and death, but mostly in children for this latter instance. Listeria leads to fever, muscle aches, and meningitis, and if you're carrying a baby, complications like miscarriages or stillbirth. Campylobacter can lead to things like diarrhea, fever, and cramps. It can also, under certain circumstances, trigger Guillain-Barré syndrome. All of these things are on top of the fact that you have to be mindful of the fact that it's a vulnerable population that often gets this milk. That is either those who are elderly who are thinking yesteryear was better, idiots who think the world is flat or something similar and think raw milk is better, or children who are being fed it by their parents who think they're doing the right thing and they're not. Of course, that's also not accounting for things like those who are immunocompromised, have a cancer, receiving other treatment, have multiple comorbidities, etc., etc., etc. So what actually causes the contamination? We've already touched on one of those, which is just handling issues. And that's really down to essentially hygiene practices on the farm. And to be blunt about this, you really can't get complete sterility on a dairy farm or wherever else it is you're farming to get your animals from, whether it's sheep or goats. And that's because not only do you have the animals themselves are a living being and therefore they will have bacteria on and in them, but they're also in the wild, which means they'll get things like dirt spread on them. They're likely to encounter feces at some point, and of course, just simply being in the world, you wind up with bacteria on you. So the animals themselves are a source of contamination. You then have the environment. Not only do you have the animals walking through things like dirt and manure or contaminated water, they can then bring these into the places where you're milking the animals. So this is another way to introduce it, particularly if the water you're using to clean the animals, let's say washing their udders or feet, isn't, let's say, properly sterilized between animals. Of course, you have the human handling factor, that is, humans either touching parts of the animal or themselves and then transmitting, let's say, whatever they managed to pick up elsewhere. All of these things could just as easily, though, be avoided with pasteurization, because even if that did occur, you would still find that, pasteurization has killed off anything that happened to contaminate it through the process of milking them, collecting the milk, moving the milk, etc. Another issue is that when you look at raw milk on a larger scale, and we don't just mean in terms of, say, one dairy to another, but generally speaking within state-to-state levels and sometimes even country levels, there's no standardization in regulation. So what could be a safe farming practice for one farm could be considered insufficient on another farm or overkill somewhere else. And so you don't really know whether or not the protocols that are being followed are the best or even at an adequate level for what needs to be done. And of course, on top of that, well, you don't even know if they're testing for pathogens and what pathogens they're testing for. They may not account for certain bacteria, just not bothering or not knowing they need to, or in some cases thinking that, well, that's not a thing that happens here, so we don't need to test for it, despite probably should be testing for that. And even if they do test, well, you don't always catch what happens. This is something that's true of even pasteurized milk, that occasionally, for whatever reason, it slips through the gaps. We'll get to that later on, as that's likely to be an argument that comes up. If you look at government-level data, things get rather, let's say, bleak for raw milk. Between 1998 and 2018, so 20 years, the CDC tracked various illness outbreaks related to raw milk. Now, there are 200 such outbreaks over that time frame, so we're talking more or less 10 a year. From that, thousands of people became ill, hundreds were hospitalized, and there were a number of deaths. And more to that is that these numbers, due to the nature of what you're looking at, don't really get reported very well, so you can reasonably confidently say it's an underreporting of cases. Now, later researchers looked at this and gone, okay, if we know roughly what the raw milk market is, and we know what the, let's say, pasteurized milk market is, what is the rough odds ratio or hazard ratio? And they found that raw milk is 840 times more likely to cause illness than pasteurized milk. Understand, this is, for the most part, a relative risk. That is, when you were to assume you have an equal number of both consumers of raw milk and you have an equal number of consumers of pasteurized milk, which of them would have higher incidences? And this is where you get that 840 times number. The reason for that is very simple. It's 840 times higher if, for example, you were to look at how many outbreaks of raw milk there are now, and you multiply that population by the consumer base for pasteurized milk. It doesn't necessarily mean it will be 840 times higher if that were true, and that is to give you a ratio or a hazard ratio that is commensurate with what the equal market share would be. Now, the reason we say this is very important, it's because based on that alone, even if you were to just increase the raw milk sales and you were to decrease pasteurized milk sales, you may find that there is a smaller percentage or ratio of raw milk sales causing disease than it is with this particular setting. Now, we have to come to the point of what makes raw milk become dangerous. Theoretically, when it comes out of the cow, it is no more dangerous than pasteurized milk, and, well, first of all, we've mentioned the introduction of pathogens during milking, but that is, at least in the case of pasteurization, accounted for. But it's not with raw milk, because, well, raw milk doesn't get pasteurized. You get that contamination with the, well, in this case, whatever pathogen it is, but let's just say, for example, it's E. coli. Well, that one cow's milk has now contaminated every other cow's milk that it's mixed with. It's not just like it's one cow that's going to be producing one bottle of bad milk. It'll be one cow that gets combined with all the other cow's milk, and this leads to all of it going bad. Then we have the fact that between the milk being collected and the milk being processed, there is a period where it's kept at a temperature where the bacteria can multiply. Now, the issue with this is that milk is a fairly rich media for bacteria and other pathogens to grow very well. And the only way you can stop that is if you keep it at a low temperature, that is below 4 degrees Celsius or 40 freedom units. If you don't do that, well, yeah. You basically have a nice rich media and you get to start your own little microbiology experiment. The next is improper storage and transportation, but this is going to vary somewhat as we're operating on the premise here that it's a small-scale operation. And in many cases it will be when we talk about raw milk because it's an unregulated product. Mostly because, well, the regulations exist, but they say don't sell it, rather than being a case of you have no rules at all. And so because people are flouting those regulations, they then sell it, or it's a very relatively unpopular product, and so you don't have a very large group getting involved in making it. This means that the risk is significantly exacerbated for improper storage and or transportation. We've mentioned issues around cross-contamination, but even if you have, say, one farm that screws up, that shouldn't affect everybody else, except that by the time milk gets to a bottling plant, well, that's what happens. You mix it with all the other milk, or if you don't mix it with the other milk, you have the same common equipment that then leads to contamination of other milk. So it's not like you just have one small accident. Remembering that at no stage prior to now has pasteurization been done or anything similar that would kill off any of these bacteria. So they all remain viable and present not only in the milk that gets delivered, but also now in the shared equipment. Now, there is, as we mentioned, an argument from raw milk advocates that the bacteria within it are good bacteria or probiotics, and, well, no, not really. The evidence is pretty damn clear, as we mentioned. Most bacteria that are inside milk at this point are not bacteria that you want to be exposed to. They're not probiotic, they're not anything like that. They are a pathogen. They will cause issues with your health. Whether it's a mild issue or a serious issue is a different matter. Now, we've already touched on this, but we'll reiterate the point. Those at risk from this, you obviously have children, because children are small, their immune system's not developed, and so if anything goes wrong with their body or their immune system, they're in for a very bad time. You have pregnant women, mostly referring back to issues around stillbirth, but also the fact that pregnancy itself is something of a comorbidity or complication when it comes to any illness. The elderly, because their bodies and immune system are weak, very much like children, and immunocompromised individuals. After all of this, there are of course going to be counter-arguments in the comments section, and it'll be interesting to see if the comments are exactly what we're about to describe, as the idiots stop watching the video the moment their feelings were hurt with facts. The common kinds of counter-arguments and responses you're going to find are things like, raw milk is more natural and nutritious. Well, we can ignore the first part of that, as natural has no meaningful or useful definition in the purposes of this. But nutrition? See, that one's a little more complicated. For example, there are some very heat-sensitive vitamins, nutrients, etc. Vitamin C is a good example of this, where heating it will denature it and make it useless. That's why vitamin C drinks don't work as well quite often. But the actual change in milk, it's kind of minimal, and really it doesn't change anything anywhere near enough to be useful. Any kind of minor change is really going to be offset, if not outweighed, by not only the fact you can consume more of the milk because it's more readily available and reliably available, but from a reasonably balanced diet you're getting the difference anyway, so it doesn't change anything. Next is that raw milk from healthy cows is safe, but no. Strictly speaking, even when you look at something like, say, pasteurized milk, where, strictly speaking, pasteurization is used because even if the cows appear to be healthy and safe, they may not be. There is no way to provide a 100% guarantee that there is no pathogens that will be transmitted from cows through equipment or somehow contaminate all of the milk and equipment used in the bottling plant. It's simply not something viable in an agricultural setting. Next is the argument that, well, proper handling makes this not an issue, and, well, yeah, doing this can reduce the risk, but it cannot eliminate it. This is just a fact of life, and because of the nature of what raw milk is, any contamination that does occur from that small risk essentially gets amplified because of time and opportunity to increase, and therefore, whatever small safety margin occurs is really counteracted. What pasteurization does is extend that safety margin considerably further because any bacteria that might possibly have gotten into the milk will be knocked down to such a small level, if not entirely killed off, that they can't cause problems. In short, raw milk is dangerous, pretty much because it can and likely does harbour at least some pathogens. These pathogens can cause serious, if not fatal, illnesses, and the milk itself, even if let's assume that you were to consume it as soon as you purchased it, that is, essentially same-day consumption, well, you're going to wind up in one of two situations. You just consumed a lot of milk, in which case you're going to have constipation, or you've just consumed a whole lot of bacteria and you're going to be ill. That's the problem here. By contrast, pasteurization prevents all those being a consideration. And it's not like you can say, well, this farm is one I know well and I know they do the right thing. Contamination isn't something that's generally going to be a deliberate act. It's going to occur due to some sort of lapse, break, or other problem to do with the handling, the sanitation, all sorts of things that can affect the effectiveness of the ability to keep milk safe. It's just the way life is. Anything living will have the risk of contaminating whatever you're working with. Claims that it's better tasting is likely to be only vaguely true, and only those who actually have a particularly, not necessarily refined palate, but a particular sense of taste that can tell the differences. There's almost no data to support it being healthier, just simply because there are so many more people who get sick and die from it. The risks are significantly more, simply because of that, and pasteurization doesn't affect the nutritional value of milk in any appreciable way. You are getting the same nutritional benefit, none of the health hazards, and pretty much the same sort of taste by pasteurizing milk, and you don't run the risk of dying, probably from diarrhea, but any number of other interesting and unusual diseases or conditions. Thank you for watching this video. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.